Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the st.rb podcast. Once a month, the San Diego Ruby Users Group gets together to discuss various items of interest within the Ruby community. In this episode, Patrick Crowley will be discussing Summer of Rails, as well as his first Summer of Rails project, Graffletopia.
All right, so hi, I'm Patrick Crowley. I'm kind of a web designer and developer. My background is sort of doing a lot of PHP, MySQL-based web app development for about the past 6 years or so. And most recently, I was working for Eventful, which is sort of a Web 2.0 startup that's in town. It's kind of a event search engine. And I actually went to RailsConf, a week or two ago, which was really awesome. I don't know if you guys checked out some of the blog posts or videos about that, but it was really cool. But interestingly, I was probably one of the only people at RailsConf that actually hadn't used Rails yet. So sort of like AA, I can kind of say, my name is Patrick Crowley, and I've been using Rails for exactly 1 week. So I kind of wanted to show you guys what I've been working on, both in terms of Summer of Rails and also my first sort of serious Rails app. I mean, ideally, that would have been great, but I sort of had some other stuff I was working on, some other projects that weren't Rails, so I just didn't get around to it. But certainly I got a lot of value out of going there, meeting a lot of people in the Rails community, and particularly, I think it was really great for all the presentations on Rails deployment issues, because if you're going to actually take your app and roll it out or try to scale it, I think, if you know about Capistrano and those sorts of things, that's going to be really helpful. Summer of Rails. Basically, the idea behind Summer of Rails is sort of Rails Day meets Summer of Code meets Rails newbies. And the idea was I felt like myself and some of my friends and probably other people out there know that Rails is sort of the next big thing and are very interested in it, but for their own reasons haven't gotten around to actually building a real Rails app. They've gotten the books, they've built the Hello app, they've maybe built a shopping cart, but that's been the end of it. And so they're sort of learning it slowly, but with no real deadline for getting it done. So the idea behind Summer of Code is, let me show you the logo first of all. So sort of Summer of Rails. But Summer of Rails is very simple, actually. The idea is, okay, finish learning Rails. Just dive into the books, really get your head around it. Make something. Make something small, some kind of useful web app. It could be very simple, just something to get started, something you could show off to a friend or other people might find useful. And then just badge it as a Summer of Rails project. So the idea is to kind of get the sort of newbie contingent or people who are maybe very good web app developers and other technologies, whether it's PHP or Java, kind of on board with Rails. So I've actually kind of built sort of a website to go with that, which is at summerofrails.org, which has been up. I sort of launched this at RailsConf. So basically, it's just what I just showed you, sort of, giving you some, tips on how to learn Rails, make something useful, and then badge it. And I've made some badges you can put onto your Summer Rails projects. No, it's not. I mean, in terms of it, if I go back to the other slide, what I meant by this basically is, Rails Day was this thing that happened, was it 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago? Okay. It was sort of like one day where, Rails developers had 24 hours, in teams to come up with something really cool. And how many were there actually? Okay, that's pretty huge. Okay, wow. So, it's not up yet, right? Yeah, they haven't really. Are they announcing the winners pretty soon, or? Okay. Yeah, so yeah, basically Rails Day was this sort of competition where I think some of the more talented Rails developers that are out there, gave themselves 24 hours to make some cool stuff. And I actually kind of thought about this project before Rails Day, but I think it's a good way to describe it. Summer of Code is, of course, Google's thing where they mentor students in various topics and to develop new technology. But the main focus, of course, is Rails newbies, people who definitely will be learning Rails, will be shipping apps at some point, but kind of giving them some momentum to do it. So, like I said, the idea essentially is, those three things: finish learning Rails, make something by the end of the summer, which I haven't really given a day for that, but you can figure the end of August or beginning of September, and then just badge it. And of course, like there are a bunch of badges which I'll show you later. I got them. Sorry, these badges here. Text links are cool too, or just telling your friends that it's out there. Certainly, there's some level of projects that this sort of badging maybe is not appropriate for. But for smaller kind of hobby projects, I think it might be cool. So yeah, with that, I kind of wanted to show off my first Rails project. Like I said, I've only been writing Rails stuff for exactly 1 week, and I think it's kind of interesting what I was able to accomplish in that week. And basically, I was working kind of half days, so in total time, I probably put in 3 days worth of effort into this with basically no knowledge of Rails at all. No, it's more like 5 or 6. So, no. Like I said, my background primarily has been sort of PHP, MySQL. So yeah, the idea for the site, it's called Graffletopia, and it's a website for sharing OmniGraffle stencils. And I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with OmniGraffle. It's sort of essentially the Visio for the Mac. It's a sort of charting and diagramming program, but it also has to be very good at creating user interfaces. I think it's much better than the traditional method of, say, doing your UI in Photoshop and Illustrator. OmniGraffle is very good for sort of just building stuff quickly and sorts of things you probably would do, when you're designing a layout. So just to show you, this is a sample, OmniGraffle document. So very quickly I can make some boxes. Oops. Yeah. So it's very easy to sort of style stuff up. You can sort of use these tools to build a pretty decent UI without having to use Illustrator or Photoshop. So I find that if you do those things, you get too kind of uptight with pixel perfection and slicing stuff and all that kind of stuff. And this is, I think, a much better way to work. So one of the cool features of OmniGraffle is it sort of has some clip art stuff called stencils. So the idea is you can take essentially any OmniGraffle document and package it up as a stencil, and then the objects in that document can be reused in other documents. So what you can do is, this is a sample stencil. This stencil is for GUI design. And what I can do, if I need a text area in my mock-up, I can drag that out. Or a pull-down menu, those sorts of things. And there are lots of different types of stencils. Here's a USA map. So let's say I was doing a site about Texas, I could drag that out. Very easily, if I wanted, I could customize it. Get rid of the shadow, and then I have kind of a cool object I can use. So it's kind of a cool thing. Personally, I don't actually use stencils all that much, except for maybe form design on occasion if I need to do a mock-up or something. As of today, there are basically about 50 stencil files that people have created for sharing. And these are some of the ones that are out there. But I think part of the reason that that's the case, I'll bring up the OmniGraffle website here. So this is the OmniGraffle website where you can read about the product and download it. And they have a link here called Extras, where they've added kind of a very nice list of some of the stencils that are available. But since my background is kind of user experience, I find this very frustrating. It's kind of hidden on their site. You actually can't preview the stencils. So, if I want to know what gardening's like, I really need to download it first, which might take a second. And then, open it back up in OmniGraffle and see, well, do I really want to use these objects? Would they ever be useful to me in my design work? And this page really has been here since OmniGraffle came out, which has probably been, 4 or 5 years now. So if you look at it, you can't really preview the stencils. You can't see when new stencils are added. It's not clear, if one's been updated and those sorts of things. It's just not a very good site. It's not a very good community for what I think is a great product. And this product tends to be used by a lot of, user interface designers on the Mac. So yeah, basically, So I decided to create a site I call Graffletopia. So the idea is that instead of the site I just showed you, you would have a site where you could sort of browse the stencils and actually see them before you download them. So for instance, here's a web flowchart stencil, whatever that is. You can see that that's the name, that's the category it's listed in, that's the preview. You can see the download link, the number of downloads, that sort of thing. There's also, you can browse by topic. So if you just want to see the architecture stencils or the maps or Mac specific stuff, you can do that. So yeah, like I said, basically I built this whole site in a week. It's got some of the standard stuff. I guess my models are stencils, categories, users. Some of the site features are, being able to actually look at individual stencils, as I was just showing you. So this is sort of a stencil detail page. I actually have comments here. And I've got pretty rich user services, so you can register, you can log in, you can log out. You can get your lost password, you can change your password. I didn't actually. I looked at those, and they seemed to be a bit much for what I wanted to do. And I forgot. I basically found a really good blog post that had a much simpler model for user stuff, so I kind of stole that. It was about 100 lines of code. That's the model there, and this is the controller. In total, this whole app was probably maybe 200 lines of Rails code, half of which is probably just the user stuff. So when you compare that to what you would normally be doing with PHP, particularly, I know if I were to write this myself, it might be 1,000 lines of code, or 1,200 lines of code, whatever. And so what's really interesting about Rails to me is that it allows you to build sites like this very rapidly, which, to me, this is a pretty niche site. And I've had this idea for, a year or two, actually, but I never really wanted to commit the resources as a PHP developer to put this together. Or I didn't want to, maybe take a blogging software app, like WordPress or something, and adapt it to do this. I just wanted something very, very simple. And with Rails, I could do that. So yeah, that's basically the site. I wanted to show you guys a couple cool things I did that were slightly outside of sort of the standard Rails way of doing things, or the way one tends to do stuff if you're just learning Rails. The first one is kind of easy. No scaffolding. I think people get drawn to Rails because of scaffolding, but it's largely a waste of time. I think it's good if you're, just want to see how it works, basically, just to get something up and running. But I wanted, in my learning process, to kind of start hard and not rely on scaffolding at all, sort of start fresh. The second thing is I made some sort of custom errors. Rails does have some nice code for generating errors, say on a form. If you've got a form and you're validating the presence of certain fields or the format of certain fields. Rails has, some nice ways of doing that. So, for instance, I have a kind of page here where you can add a new stencil to the site. So, be able to tell people or tell me the name of the stencil, the description of it, download link, add a screenshot, and then, tell the site a little bit about, you as an author of the stencil. So when I started out, I kind of was using the standard. Let me find it here. Yeah, the sort of standard code for showing errors, which is the error messages for function. So you just give it your model, and you give it a tag you want to display the errors in, and then you're kind of good to go. So say I'm trying to add the stencil, it's definitely going to validate on a couple fields. And so this is the sort of standard message you get back from Rails, which is definitely nice. But for me, it's a little bit verbose. I prefer UIs a little bit simpler. Essentially, if you look at this, it's telling you that something's wrong twice. It's saying 4 errors prohibited the stencil from being saved. There were problems with the following fields. That's kind of implied, really, by the fact that you didn't complete that action. So I wanted to kind of make that simpler. So I noticed that, let's get this right, in the actual documentation for this method, it's got a copy of the source. And I saw a blog post where someone mentioned that if you wanted to customize this, just grab the source, throw it into a helper, and customize it. So that's what I wound up doing. So if you look at the user's helper, I took that function and kind of just made my own version of it because I wasn't happy with some of the messaging that it was creating. So if I switch to the custom one that I made, and then I try to post that form again. So just to see, this is the existing error, and here's my version. So it's just cleaner. It's a little bit, friendlier. I don't count the number of errors. I just make it clear that they're having trouble adding the stencil, and here's why. And probably before I release this site, I'll customize this some more. So, there's some cases, not on this form, but other forms I have where, say if I'm validating for the presence of email, and I'm also validating for the format of email, making sure it's a legitimate email, I don't want 2 errors for that. If I haven't filled out the email at all, I don't want to see that, I don't have an email plus the email's not valid. I just want to see that I don't have an email first. So it would be nice to have more of a hierarchical error system there for certain forms, so you get smarter messaging. All right, so the third thing I did is kind of interesting, was doing more RESTful style URLs. Out of the box, I think Rails has very good, sort of clean, modern URLs. This is something I kind of had to discover for myself in building apps. If some of you guys may not be familiar with this, but all right, let's just say we have some site.com where we want to look at, movies. Pretty standard query string might be something like this. Where essentially you're passing all these variables in your query string. And it can get kind of nasty, Yahoo's cleaned up a little bit lately, but, if you look at a news article, stuff like that, it's a bit long. Users don't really care about most of this crap. They just care about maybe the end of the URL, which is sort of human readable. So by default, some of the URLs, like I was saying, in Rails are very clean. So if I wanted to see the first stencil that I have, this is a pretty standard URL scheme. Essentially you have stencils here as the controller, show is the method, and then one is the ID. And that's not bad, but when I see show, I kind of find that to be, verbose. It's not necessary. It's sort of implied by the fact that you're looking at the stencil. So what I wanted to do was get rid of that and have the page still work. So I don't know if you guys have done this before. zoom that in a bit. But basically, if you want to customize your URLs in Rails, you use the routes.rb file, which is in the config folder. And by default, this is what most of your stuff is going to use, the controller action ID style. That's why when I did stencils/show/1, that worked. That's sort of the default way of doing things. But I decided, like I said, I wanted to kind of do something a little bit better than that. So the one I just did, where I did stencils/1, is just this special route right here. So all I'm saying is essentially look for this pattern. The URL should start with stencils and then have the ID. And if you find that, redirect to the stencils controller and the show action. So I did a whole bunch of these just around the idea of kind of improving the user experience. If you're not familiar with REST, it's often used as a way of, sort of a much better way of doing web services as opposed to SOAP or XML-RPC. And the whole idea is to kind of build your web services on top of HTTP and use the standard sort of HTTP, language to, say I'm going to add a new stencil or what have you. And this is a site where I'm not actually doing any kind of API work. I don't intend to have an API for this ever. But thinking RESTfully, I think, leads you towards just cleaner URLs. And it's one of the things I like about working with Rails because as a designer, web designer, I've done a lot of web standard stuff. So, the markup for this site is very, very clean, very, very semantic. It's all XHTML, CSS. There are no tables, blah, blah, blah. But once you write enough CSS, you wind up kind of thinking that way, that sort of this semantic clarity you're looking for in your markup winds up, affecting the rest of your development. So what's great about Rails is that you're essentially, in building your models and controllers, you're thinking semantically in the sense you're thinking of objects. So I think it's best to represent those same objects in your URLs as cleanly as possible. Just another example, if I want to say sign out, using the logout action, basically that's part of the user's controller. But I don't think my users really care about seeing /users, at least on this site. I'm not going to have user directory. I'm never going to expose that. So, why should I have that in the URL? So I basically taken it out. So that way you just get /logout or /login or /signup and so on. So those are sort of the three things I did on this site that are a little bit interesting, a little bit out of the, pushing Rails a little bit, beyond sort of what people tend to do with it. And I think it's pretty cool that, just with, a week worth of playing around, not really know what I'm doing, but I was able to do these things and really change the way the Rails works and not have it break and not have it be a major headache on my part to figure out how to do it and just sort of, evolve from this. All right, so what's left for this site before I launch it? I'll probably do another round of, cleanup on the UI, just getting it to where I want it to be. But in terms of my Rails stuff, when I add a new stencil, I need to figure out how to select categories because stencils can belong to, multiple categories. So that's something I haven't done yet. This is actually a real question I have for people. How should Action Mailer be configured to support Postfix on macOS 10 Tiger? Because I've Googled the hell out of that and I haven't found an answer. Just send mail out. Yeah, I didn't have any success with that. So I've got Postfix running, so I just want to kind of throw it to Postfix and let that send it. Say again? Okay, cool. And then I need to figure out a good way to count the number of downloads for each stencil. So if you look closely on the stencil detail page, I'm kind of faking that number right now. So down here it says 5 downloads. But they all have 5 downloads. But that'll change. It's not a deal breaker. I'll figure out how to do that. But so that's that. And so yeah, back to Summer of Rails. If you guys, I'm just curious, how many people have actually shipped a Rails app? Okay, so and how many of you shipped? Okay, but you're kind of the exception. But everybody else, like, How many of you shipped? Like one? Okay. Yeah, so, I feel like you guys are probably ahead of the game. A lot of people who haven't done anything yet. So if you can kind of help me spread the word on this, I'd appreciate it. I got a lot of great feedback at RailsConf on this. You can download badges at summerofrails.org/badges. They're PNGs and GIFs, and they're all different sizes. And dig the site too if you want. That's it. Well, sir, I love tags, and I think that tags are really great for certain types of sites. But I felt like for this site, tags would be kind of overkill. Currently, there's a total of about 45 stencils in the world, and I think when this site comes up, maybe there'll be 100 6 months from now.
I also struggle with that. You can't talk about tags a lot, but it seems like here, a lot of users associate those.
Oh, sure. This guy over here would be the first to tell you that I'm like the sole believer in folksonomies, and ultimately I think tagging is superior for most types of content. But given the small number of objects I have, like I said, I'll probably never have more than 100 stencils. It seemed like overkill in the sense that, yes, it's somewhat limiting by having fixed categories, but since there's so few objects, it just makes it easier to navigate, easier to find stuff that's there. Whereas if you look compared to, say, Flickr, you've got millions of photos, so tagging is very appropriate because, putting them into 10 categories just doesn't work, or even 1,000 categories. It just would be kind of a pain in the ass. So generally, I'm totally pro tagging, but this is just one case where I think, just from a user experience, it might be a little bit easier doing it this way. Taganista? Sure. Yeah. So. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So, yeah.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.